Boa noite. A partir de agora, você assiste ao Espaço Público, programa de entrevistas da TV Brasil. Hoje nós vamos debater a crise econômica mundial e os rumos do capitalismo, 25 anos depois da queda do Muro de Berlim, com o professor britânico David Harvey, um dos principais estudiosos da obra de Karl Marx. Lembrando que o programa de hoje é gravado e não teremos participação pelas redes sociais. Para participar da conversa em nossos estúdios, convidamos a professora Flávia Barros, do Centro de Pesquisa e Pós-graduação sobre as Américas da Universidade de Brasília. A jornalista Helena Martins, da Agência Brasil, também está conosco. Eu sou Paulo Moreira Leite, apresentador e âncora do Espaço Público. Professor, boa noite.
Thank you. Thank you.
Eu gostaria de começar essa nossa conversa perguntando para o senhor, que estuda o capitalismo há muito tempo, que está publicando mais um livro sobre a obra de Karl Marx, como é que nós podemos entender essa crise do capitalismo que se abriu em 2008 e que até agora parece que não tem remédio? Está cada vez pior, né? Quer dizer, a China, que era vista como uma grande pulmão do crescimento atual, está declinando. A Europa está parada. A recuperação americana é muito modesta, não consegue resolver questões de emprego, não consegue recuperar a economia para a maioria da população. O que está acontecendo, professor?
Well, let me make two comments. First, I don't think you should see what happened in 2007, 2008 as just an isolated event. Actually, there was a continuous series of crises that ran from the mid-1990s onwards, included the collapse in Argentina, the earlier collapses in East Asia, and the interesting thing about 2007, 2008 was for the first time it really hit the United States. And of course, if something hits the United States, it's called a world crisis. Everywhere else, it's a regional crisis. So then 2007, 2008, but it didn't hit evenly everywhere. China came out of it fairly fast. Brazil and Latin America were not hit as hard as many other parts of the world. It's been highly concentrated in Europe and North America. And in a sense, what we're seeing is a process of moving the crisis around. As you said, China is not doing so well these days, and anybody who's associated with the China trade is not doing so well, so Brazil is kind of down, much of Latin America is down. So you've got to see a continuous process of crisis movement, as it were, from one part of the world to another, and from one sector to another. From, for example, housing to finance to governmental finance. I mean, it just seems to move and move. And I would want to argue that it's one of the central features of a capitalist economy to have some violent contradictions, which means it's perpetually crisis-prone, and we continue to be in the middle of this process as it continues to find different ways to express itself.
Vamos conhecer um pouco mais sobre o professor de antropologia da pós-graduação da Universidade da cidade de Nova York, David Harvey.
Aos 78 anos, o geógrafo britânico David Harvey é um dos mais ativos estudiosos da obra de Karl Marx nos dias atuais. Professor na Universidade da cidade de Nova York, onde leciona antropologia, Harvey trouxe Karl Marx do universo de trabalhadores e burgueses das fábricas da Europa do século XIX, onde nasceu a crítica ao regime capitalista, para o mundo das grandes cidades do século XXI. Harvey é um dos principais teóricos das revoltas urbanas ocorridas depois da crise mundial de 2008 nos Estados Unidos, na Espanha, na Turquia e também no Brasil. Seu curso acadêmico sobre o Capital, a principal obra de Marx, já teve 600 mil acessos desde que foi disponibilizado na internet. Publicado em 1992, seu livro Condição Pós-Moderna foi considerado pelo jornal inglês Independent uma das 50 obras mais importantes de não ficção escritas depois da Segunda Guerra Mundial. Nascido em Treveris, na Alemanha, Karl Marx morreu em Londres em 1883. Sua obra inspirou diversas gerações de líderes políticos em todo o mundo, mas a maioria dos regimes comunistas, criada a partir de suas ideias, acabou extinta nas últimas décadas do século passado. Mesmo assim, o pensamento de Marx conserva uma influência reconhecida na análise econômica, na filosofia e na ciência política. Em seus livros e palestras, David Harvey explica o interesse atual pela obra de Marx em função dos impasses da economia internacional. Harvey acredita que os ataques ao estado de bem-estar social ocorridos nas últimas décadas ajudaram a recriar o mundo de exploração e desigualdade que está na origem dos trabalhos de Marx.
Professor, o senhor colocou há pouco que o capitalismo carrega várias contradições, elas são inerentes ao próprio sistema. Mas essa crise atual talvez não mostre que essa lógica de manutenção, através de uma adaptação, muitas vezes apoiada pelo Estado, inclusive, não está chegando a um esgotamento, por exemplo, diante da crise ambiental?
Yes, I think that the interesting thing about this crisis, as opposed to the one, say, in the 1930s and the one in the 1970s, is that we don't really see any new thoughts coming out about how to resolve it. We don't seem to see any new ways to think about the deployment of state power. In fact, what is so interesting about this crisis is that it does not seem to have an exit, whereas there seemed to be an exit in the 1930s, which came with a new role for the state, and an exit in the 1970s, which was to release entrepreneurial capitalism from regulatory constraints. Now nobody seems to know what to do except to continue to sort of business as usual. And the business as usual is doing what business was already doing, which is making the rich much, much richer, while the rest of the world does rather poorly. So we have a very interesting situation right now where capital is actually doing rather well, but the people are doing very poorly.
Nós estamos também comemorando os 25 anos da publicação de seu livro clássico, A Condição da Pós-Modernidade, uma pesquisa sobre as origens da mudança cultural. Ao longo desses 25 anos, o senhor identificaria alguma mudança significativa em termos de mudança cultural?
I think the cultural change has been very strong. In fact, whereas it seems to me that capital used to spend a lot of its time producing things which lasted, capital has become more and more fascinated with producing things that don't last. They either fall apart, and one of the things that doesn't last is, of course, the economy of the spectacle. So the actual production of urban spectacle starts to become a big part of what capital investment is about, because there's no lifetime to that spectacle. You have a World Cup and it's all over. It's all gone. You have an Olympic Games, it's all over. It's all gone. It's instantaneous consumerism. And I think much of urban life has been transformed into instantaneous consumerism. And I think that within that, cultural expression has become more important because it's part of that instantaneous consumerism, but at the same time, cultural critique has also become much more important. And so we see many social movements around the world that are led by the cultural producers, who are kind of highly critical of what you might call compensatory consumerism, highly critical of the conditions under which cultural production should take place, and are highly critical of the circumstances of urbanization, which has been produced by this rapid turnover society that we now live in.
Vamos ouvir um membro do Laboratório de Estudos Marxistas da Universidade de São Paulo, Ricardo Mussi. Ele nos enviou uma pergunta que tem muito a ver com os livros que o senhor está publicando agora.
Eu gostaria de saber como e por que você considera que o Capital é ainda um livro atual e tem algo a dizer para o nosso presente histórico.
I think Marx was very astute and very clever. in saying that there are many things about capital that are ephemeral, which don't last, but what he did was to try to say, what are the basic conditions under which capital gets reproduced? And in so doing, I think he set up a way of thinking that was is as true today as it was at the time when he wrote. And I find it fascinating, since I teach this text, or have taught it for nearly 40 years, to find that every year I see something new in the text, but also every year what I find myself doing is saying how incredibly insightful this was in terms of things going on around us in the here and now. For instance, I remember in the 1990s there was a lot of agitation in the United States about clothing being produced in sweatshops in the much of the developing world. And I was getting students to read Marx's chapter on the working day and read these accounts of what was happening in the sweatshops of the maquila zones of Mexico or in the Philippines or wherever. And you couldn't tell the difference between what was going on now and what was going on back then. And I think it's so amazing that here is this analysis that manages to remain fresh and very meaningful and very insightful, even though it's been all those years since it was first written.
Professor, eu queria voltar para uma resposta anterior. O senhor falou que a vida contemporânea tem sido muito marcada pela instantaneidade. E a gente também percebe que os movimentos sociais também têm sido marcados, às vezes, por uma explosão que, às vezes, não tem uma continuidade. Nós vivenciamos isso na Europa, aqui também na América Latina, especificamente no Brasil. A gente tem, inclusive, se debatido sobre esse tema. Essa é uma influência marcante desse tempo, dessa contemporaneidade?
I think it is one of the signs of the time. I mean, one of the things I've spent a lot of my time doing is trying to understand urbanization using Marx's categories. And increasingly I find it works very well because I think a lot of investment now is about city building and about urban investment. And in fact, one of the big ways in which China came out of the recession of 2008, 2009 was through an incredible process of city building. So China's consumed half of the world's cement and half of the world's steel supplies in building new cities, and that's the way it got out of it. But actually, this has not been uncommon. I mean, there's a saying about the United States that it got out of the Great Depression of the 1930s by, after 1945, building houses and filling them with things. So that urbanization has always had a connection with what's going on in the economy in general. But I think as time has gone forward and urbanization has become even more significant with more and more people living in cities, so the urbanization and the capital accumulation going together has become very much more important. And I think that it's interesting that much of the protest that's occurred over the last 15, 20 years has been urban protest. It's been a protest about the qualities of urban life. I mean, the kinds of revolts that occurred in the 19th century were work-based over the conditions of industrial labor. Now we see a huge amount of discontent emerging over the qualities of urban life. For instance, what happened in Brazil last year was partly about that. What happened in Turkey with Gezi Park was quality of urban life. So I think that we have to ask the sort of question, is the nature of political protest changing? And should we reconceptualize what we mean by a proletariat? So I tend to redefine the proletariat as everybody who is producing and reproducing urban life. And that is a lot of people who are not conventionally seen as being part of the proletariat. For instance, the delivery drivers, the taxi cab drivers, the sort of people who put up... It's no longer talking about the factories, it's talking about the people on the street. So when you stand on the street and you look around you, you see people producing things. And if producing a car is considered a proletarian activity, why is producing a hamburger not considered proletarian? So I think that all of those McDonald's workers are in fact part of the proletariat. But of course, it's a very different looking proletariat from the one that we conventionally on the left regarded as being in the vanguard of social change. So yes, I think the pattern of protest, the pattern of discontent, is changing, and so is the nature of what the urban proletariat is about.
Uma perspectiva também contemporânea, culturas que não compreendem modos de produção capitalista têm possibilidade de articulação para exercer força contra-hegemônica numa escala internacional, global, visando a superação do capitalismo, pós-capitalismo. E uma pergunta relacionada a esta seria, o senhor considera possível hoje um novo projeto universal baseado na diversidade cultural como uma utopia possível?
I'm optimistic in the sense I think that anything is possible. Whether it's probable may be a different question. But one of the things I find interesting about many of the people in cultural production that I know is that they have very strong international connections. They are constantly in communication and often move around so that they move from one country to another, and they actually undertake a lot of joint events, and there are forms of organization emerging, sometimes alongside these international exhibitions. So, I don't know, you have the Sao Paulo Biennale or something, and there will be a kind of dissident Biennale alongside of it, which is cultural producers coming from different perspectives around the world. And there are many international organizations not only of that sort. One thinks of the role of the MST in, say, Via Campesina, which is, again, an international organization which has a lot of international linkages and which is making international questions about food sovereignty and, sort of local foods and the like. And we see the same thing going on environmental questions. So there's much more international contact. And again, some of this actually gets articulated through the urban system. For instance, I go back to February the 15th, 2003, when millions of people in hundreds of cities around the world all turned out simultaneously on the street and said no to going to war with Iraq. And I think this was, again, was a moment when there was a kind of almost a world expression of public opinion, a world expression of political sentiment. Of course, it came and it went. But these things, I think, are important in that they are a sign of something that could come in the future in a more permanent basis. I actually dream at some point of a League of Socialist Cities, where we had a League of Socialist Cities to say, all right, we are going to support each other in terms of how we live and how we produce, but we're going to try to do it in as non-capitalistic way as possible, with the least amount of exploitation as possible. And you can imagine something like that emerging in the way you see right now. For instance, solidarity economies linking together in Brazil and other countries in Latin America, even reaching into North America. So, I'm optimistic about some of the forms that are beginning to emerge, but there's a very long way to go. And I don't think it's probable that is all going to come together in 2 or 3 years. It's going to take a while, I think, for people to discover new ways of doing things.
Eu queria voltar à questão dos protestos urbanos no Brasil. Primeiro, eu queria reconhecer que o senhor tem muito mérito em falar que o trabalhador não é mais o proletário, não é apenas aquele ser que está na fábrica. Eu acho isso importante. No Brasil, uma das maiores categorias de trabalhadores hoje em dia são os motoboys, que ficam nas cidades e que até há pouco eles não... Imagina, eram tratados quase como enxotados. Elas acabaram de conquistar alguns direitos trabalhistas. Né? As empregadas domésticas no Brasil, que também são uma categoria de trabalhador imenso e que, né, fazem trabalho doméstico, são trabalhadoras, né? Telemarketing, quer dizer, tem tudo isso. Mas eu queria eu acho isso importante reconhecer isso, porque tem uma questão nos protestos urbanos que ocorreram no Brasil, que é uma coisa curiosa, porque eles começaram como protestos contra o aumento das passagens de ônibus, uma coisa clássica das cidades, evoluíram para um movimento que teve muitos traços conservadores. Quer dizer, boa parte do voto conservador que nós fomos ter em 2014, ele foi gestado nos protestos de 2013. Protestos que não permitiam a participação de partidos políticos, protestos que tinham, assim, palavras de ordem abertamente, assim, a favor dos militares. Elas não surgiram agora, elas surgiram nas passeatas de 2013. Ou seja, existe uma contradição nesse protesto também, que eu gostaria que o senhor comentasse, que o senhor explicasse, porque é uma questão que ficou meio estranha. Por favor.
Yeah, I think, you know, when people are discontent, when they're alienated, call it that, they can go in different political directions. And I think we have right now a situation where there is mass alienation with the political process, a feeling that there's no real democracy. There's mass alienation over conditions of life. There's mass alienation about the media and everything that is kind of fed to people through the media. So you have that mass alienation. Now, a situation of alienation is one for me where people tend to just be angry, okay? And they get angry and they can go leftwards or they can go rightwards, yes. In Europe, for example, there's been a strong revival of fascism. In Greece, there's quite a strong party. Of course, there's a rise of that in France. There's neo-movements of that kind in Britain. And so, you know, I'm not kind of saying that all the discontents with daily life in the city are all going to pour into a single left politics. No, in fact, I think there's a clear danger that some of it will end up going on to the right. But that is where a part of the big battle begins, which is how can we talk to each other about, okay, what is the nature of the problem we're faced right now? And what would be rational ways of trying to address those problems? And this is where I think it is incumbent upon those of us who have the capacity to write books and write things and be able to comment, to try to provide at least some thought, some conceptual framing for what is going on and why it is going on. So that instead of people blaming, say, immigrants or something like that for their problems, they say, well, no, this is not immigrants, this is capital.
Em Brasil de hoje, as pessoas culpam os nordestinos. O pensamento conservador brasileiro hoje descobriu um vilão que é o nordestino e que está sendo exatamente o imigrante brasileiro.
Yes, but it's very interesting. In Italy, people in northern Italy actually blame the southern Italians. People in Mumbai blame the southern Indians. I mean, there's a classic kind of way in which people in Spain blame, you know, African migrants and so on. So, you know, this is a classic way to do it. And I think it's fundamentally erroneous. But in a way, it's understandable, and we have to work very hard to kind of say, no, that's the wrong. If you got rid of all of the immigrants, I'm sorry, probably you would starve because they are actually doing most of the labor right now.
Professor Harvey, como o senhor avalia os impactos da precarização do trabalho com o neoliberalismo sobre formas de organização, ação política? Tem a ver com esse processo?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the resolution to the difficulties of the 1970s was to construct an organized assault upon the power of labor, both in the marketplace, so that wages have consistently gone down. The share of wages in national income almost everywhere has declined. But this was, what was actually set up by, in effect, a coalition of large corporate interests plus very wealthy owners to suppress the power of labor in the global economy. And I think that it has moved harder and harder and harder in that direction, which, by the way, is exactly the politics that would flow from reading Volume 1 of Marx's Capital. But it then generates a problem, which is what happens when you get to Volume 2 of Capital, which points out that if you continue in this way and workers become more and more impoverished, then you have a problem of how on earth do you find a market for your product. And at that point, of course, the solution, particularly after the 1990s or so, was give the working class credit so that they then became debt-encumbered population. So you get the huge increase in private debt, which ultimately spills over because it's unpayable. The government has to step in, so you then get the huge increase in government debt. So now we've got the indebtedness problem, which was... This is what I mean about the crisis moves around. It was a crisis of labor in the 1970s. It's been a crisis of lack of consumerism in the 1990s, which was solved by increasing the debt economy. And now it's a crisis of the debt economy, and nobody knows where to go next, except into another round of the debt economy through financing housing booms in China and housing construction booms here in Brazil and in Turkey and many of the emerging economies. You see actually a large amount of absorption of capital and labor in urban construction, particularly around mega projects and shopping malls and all those kinds of things, without paying attention to affordable housing for the mass of the population. So, this is how I see the thing moving around, and it's very interesting that in the 1970s there was a solution which was in effect, if the capitalists had read Volume 1, they would say, all right, this is what we do. And now we're in a situation where they have to read Volume 2 in order to understand, in order to get out of the problem. They've got to go back and re-empower labor. And of course, they hate the thought of doing that, and they don't want to do that. But unless they do that, I think there will be no exit from this particular dilemma that we are in.
Bem, nós vamos fazer rápido intervalo e nós voltamos em instantes entrevistando o professor David Harvey. Lembrando que o professor está lançando esse livro que está aqui, Para Entender o Capital, livros 2 e 3, que é um livro que está aí, que ajuda a compreender o pensamento de Karl Marx por um dos seus maiores especialistas no mundo. Não saia daí. O Espaço Público está de volta e hoje conversa com David Harvey, um dos mais influentes pensadores marxistas da atualidade. Nós ouvimos o professor Ladislau Dalbor, um intelectual com formação econômica e muita experiência no combate à pobreza em vários países do mundo. Ele mandou uma pergunta ao professor.
E eu queria que o senhor comentasse o seguinte, passando do que era a surplus value, digamos, a mais-valia dos tempos de uma empresa, entramos em sistemas muito mais amplos de extração da mais-valia, através dos sistemas de financiarização, através dos sistemas de juros, através da privatização. Queria que o senhor comentasse esses novos mecanismos de expropriação das populações.
I think what we've seen since the 1970s has been a very rapid expansion of the power of finance capital and of financialization as a means by which capital circulates, but increasingly it is also the means by which capital appropriates. And instead of appropriating labor in the factory and generating value that way, what the financiers do is essentially create financial asset structures through which they can spin sort of even more money capital. And so we get the rise of what I would call a fictitious capital economy. And that fictitious capital gets into not so much making things as to purchasing assets. So we saw a big boom in the asset values of housing in the United States after the year 2000. And this was, if you like, a huge absorption of capital into the housing market and through housing finance. Then, of course, the asset bubble, the rising prices, burst because people's incomes could not service the debt, and we get the crash. Now, the interesting thing that then followed was, of course, that a large number of people lost their houses. So approximately 7 million households lost their houses in the United States, which means that about 30 million people were thrown out of their houses. And then the question is, what happens to the houses? Well, the houses reverted to the banks. And the banks then sold them on to hedge funds and to private equity companies who purchased the houses at a very low cost and are now making a lot of money from renting them out. And if the housing market recovers in any way, they will then sell them off at a very, very vast project. Now, this amounts to one of the largest transfers of private property rights in US history. The only parallel was the dispossession of family farmers back in the 1930s. Because what it does is it takes the asset value of a house, takes it away from marginal and low-income populations, and essentially relocates it so that it's now in the power of financial institutions to use it as a way of accessing more money. And I think they're very anxious to see another housing boom develop, and if another housing boom develops, they will then sell it off, go through the process again. And this amounts to what I call a process of accumulation by dispossession. It's not accumulation by putting people to work, it's just an accumulation by robbery, thievery, and dispossessing people of their asset values. And as I say, in the housing case, this happened in the United States, but it wasn't confined to the United States. We saw it in Spain, we saw it in Ireland, we saw it in Eastern Europe. About 1 million people lost their houses in Hungary, for example. So this is a very general process which we're now watching, in which the rich are getting much, much richer through a process of dispossessing the mass of the population of their assets and, of course, of their rights to a decent house in a decent living environment.
Essa também foi a realidade vivenciada no Brasil nos últimos anos. Inclusive, você estava falando de megaprojetos, e a Copa, com certeza, expressou essa lógica do desenvolvimento também das cidades sobre uma lógica do capital, com milhares de removidos em todo o país, e removidos que, inclusive, passaram a reivindicar a ideia do direito à cidade. Eu queria que o senhor falasse da importância, né, dessa consigna, desse direito, também para a gente pensar outras formas de gestão e de vida nas cidades.
I think what's interesting, the way you phrase that, is the awareness that these rights are being taken away is acute upon the street. People understand it very well. What's interesting is to get my academic colleagues to take any notice that this is going on, that this is a major means of capital accumulation, and that therefore we should be, taking measures and creating policies and politics at a mega level, which actually picks up on the discontent that exists on the street. But then there's an interesting way in which the discontent which exists on the street gets articulated. I don't know how it is felt here. But the discontent in the United States is often is directed inwards. If you ask people who lost their homes, whose fault was it? They would say it was their own fault. They blame themselves. Now, this is a classic neoliberal strategy to create a thesis that says you are personally responsible for your housing, your health care, education. You have to go and create your own human capital. You have to go and build your own asset values. And if you are good people, you will get these asset values together. So many people in the United States followed that logic and indeed tried to do it, and then found they were robbed of those asset values at the end of the day in the housing crash. But instead of saying there's something systemic here that needs to be addressed, they kind of basically said, it was my fault, I was stupid, and I didn't take enough personal responsibility. And this is the way how neoliberal ideology plays a very important role in political subjectivity. And that needs, I think, to be broken. And people to say, look, this is a systemic problem. It wasn't me who did it. I got caught in a situation where you were doing this and telling me this is the way to have a good house and a good living environment. And the result was I lost everything.
Professor Harvey, desenvolvimento e democracia, duas grandes metanarrativas da modernidade, podem ser consideradas, então, diante desse problema sistêmico, como valores de referência para a sociedade contemporânea? Quais seriam os potenciais limites e desafios com vistas à garantia de uma relação mais concreta entre desenvolvimento e democracia? Ou esgotamos esses paradigmas?
I think the idea which is spread around that somehow or other capitalism likes democracy is a very false idea. It likes a certain kind of democracy. It likes the democracy of money power. So the joke in the United States, which has actually been around for a very long time, since Mark Twain, I think, first said it, which is that, you know, the United States has the best political system that money can buy. And I think that the power of money over politics means that we have a democracy of money, not of people. And this has been supported by Supreme Court decisions, which say that spending of my personal money on political campaigns is legitimate and it's a form of freedom of expression. So now the Supreme Court protects the democracy of money against the democracy of people. So what we're seeing systematically in the United States is the cutting away of the democracy of people, making it harder and harder for people to vote, to insist on identifications and cutting people out of the voting process at the same time as money is liberated. So I think that the democracy of money is now becoming dominant. And of course, this is one of the things that people don't like and feel deprived of their own democratic rights.
O senhor fala muito de Estados Unidos, de países ricos, desenvolvidos, sei lá como a gente vai falar isso. E, de repente, assim, a realidade de países como o Brasil é um pouco diferente. Por exemplo, eu acho que não dá para dizer que no Brasil as pessoas pobres seguiram cada vez mais pobres. Nos últimos anos teve um processo de distribuição de renda. Pequeno, limitado, mas aquela miséria que você via no Brasil há 15 anos, você não vê mais. Aí a pergunta que a própria democracia no Brasil, que o senhor tem razão quando diz o capitalismo não gosta de democracia, ele gosta de democracia que o dinheiro pode comprar. Considerando a realidade desses países, né, pobres, com uma população que precisa de emprego bom, que tem uma renda muito baixa, onde assim, a ausência de calorias ainda é um problema, né? Não é uma coisa assim. Como é que a gente encara essa questão do desenvolvimento? Eu digo assim, até a revolução chegar. Eu não sei se você está entendendo, quer dizer, tem que resolver problemas aqui e agora para essas pessoas. São essas pessoas que são a maioria da... Como é que a gente responde a isso? Como é que o senhor vê respostas a isso?
It's a contradictory situation. I mean, I spent some time in Ecuador, and there's no question over the last, 10, 15 years that money has been redistributed across the country to education, healthcare. Poverty has been greatly reduced by a very progressive government. but it also had to agree to a certain level of extractivism. In other words, it had to sell the oil, and it had to mine the oil. And it said it wouldn't mine the oil, but it needs the oil. So these are the kinds of compromises that often have to be made in a developmental situation. And it's what you might call a predicament to which there's no solution. If you take the oil and use it, you will get criticized because that is wrecking nature and all of that. But if you don't take it, you won't have the money to put into education, healthcare, and poverty reduction. And you're right to kind of say that in certain countries, democracy has led to the election of certain kinds of governments which are theoretically committed to a different kind strategy of development, which are theoretically anti-neoliberal, except when you get there on the ground, you find a lot of neoliberalism still around, and you find, you know, shopping malls, and you find new highways, and all the kind of developmentalism that is a little bit questionable. So I think, you know, I don't think it's for us to judge and be very judgmental about that. I think that people, every government struggles with that kind of question. And of course, the Bolsa Familia here, I think, obviously had an impact upon income distribution in the society. You know, and I think that that was a very progressive thing, and of course it came out of a democratic election and a democratic kind of process. But that is precisely why capital doesn't like democracy, and will now try to find ways to sort of democratize the electoral process to make sure that it doesn't happen anymore.
O senhor então observa alguma continuidade do neoliberalismo nos países que estão sendo governados pela esquerda, governos considerados progressistas, de esquerda, socialistas?
Yeah, I don't think, for example, here in Brazil, I don't think you've confronted the power of the financial oligarchies. I don't think you've confronted the power of the capitalist class and capitalist corporations. And I think that in some respects, you know, I'm not a sufficient expert to say exactly, but in some respects, I find in Latin America that groups of that sort are fairly content with the fact that they are able to make quite good living and quite good profits in a situation which is nominally anti-neoliberal, but which does not challenge their power. So as long as their class power remains intact, I think even in Venezuela, it was not attacked, and it was not really significantly reduced. So in a sense, they have not been dispossessed of their wealth and their power and their influence, and they're biding their time, I think, in many ways. So I don't, you know, it's not a continuation of the cruder forms of neoliberalism, but when it comes to things like regulating certain aspects of how the financial system works, there are certain things, I think, that these progressive governments have not dared to confront. So there is an undercurrent of neoliberal continuity within an anti-neoliberal surface rhetoric.
E numa perspectiva marxista, como o professor Harvey vê a ideia de socialismo no século XXI?
I think it's going to be constituted in a very different way from the past. I think that there are new models of politics which are emerging. There's a great deal of emphasis, for instance, in Argentina, about horizontal forms of organization. There's a great distrust of older Leninist forms, which are democratic centralism. There is, I think, an interest in trying to build alternative political structures which are much more open and actually much more democratic than was the traditional form of left organizing within communist parties and within even social democratic parties. So I think that these ways of organizing pay much more attention to notions of autonomy, and there is an autonomista spirit which penetrates a lot of this political organizing. It is very much, of course, about freedom of cultural expression. It's much more cultural in its concerns. And I think that it is interested in exploring alternative value structures. For instance, I think the whole question of how do we value the labor we do for each other outside of the market? And are there ways to actually increase the amount of labor we do for each other on a voluntary basis outside of market relations? And there are many people and groups in society who are busy extending that. And in some areas, such as the software development community, there's a great deal of free labor which is generated and utilized. And there are, in fact, new models of value emerging out of this. And I think on that basis, we would start to see the emergence of a different kind of socialism. Again, a lot of it is converting all of that discontent I was talking about earlier, that currently takes these ephemeral kind of explosions and then kind of says, okay, we need to actually find this new way of doing politics, and that is a very exciting set of possibilities.
A urbanista e arquiteta Mariana Fix nos enviou uma pergunta. Vamos ouvir.
Como você avalia hoje as diferentes reações aos milhões de despejos ocorridos nos Estados Unidos a partir de 2007, em função da crise econômica mundial, já que esse foi, provavelmente, um dos maiores exemplos do que você chama de acumulação por espoliação?
Yeah, we talked a little bit about that on accumulation by dispossession and what that means, but I'd like to point out that this is not the only form that this is taking in these times. What we're confronted with worldwide right now is what some people like to call land grab. That is that assets are being bought up everywhere, large tracts of land in Africa. I think here too in Latin America, there's a lot of pressure on land to be sort of bought up by corporate and sovereign wealth funds. And I think that what we're seeing is a gradual sort of dispossession of the right of people to live on planet Earth without paying a rent to somebody in order to be able to continue to occupy some space. So to me, this is, again, a sort of way in which the power of the renter is now becoming less and less significant, while the power of the landlords is becoming even more significant.
A gente vê, então, que tem um problema nas cidades, com todos esses sujeitos que têm vivenciado contradições intensas. Tem também a expoliação que se dá no campo. Acho que a questão indígena é muito clara, né? A gente estava falando de governos progressistas, mas tanto no Equador, na Bolívia, no Brasil, são os indígenas que estão sofrendo com esse modelo de desenvolvimento. Então, acho que não seria o momento de pensar uma alternativa de sociedade que vá além dessa gestão de interesses, que, na verdade, esmaga os interesses de minorias? Não seria o momento de falar em anticapitalismo, de fato?
Eu queria complementar, porque nós estamos terminando. Eu queria perguntar assim, o senhor conhece algum modelo de socialismo na vida concreta que o empolgue, que o senhor acha que tem ali uma saída, que podia servir de debate para o futuro?
One of the things I like about reading Marx is that Marx always insists that if there are solutions, down the line, they already exist around us. And that we don't have to think about some utopia or some other. Right. We take things that are going on around us and say, let us expand this sphere of activity. Actually, capital works in the other way. One of the ways in which neoliberalism worked was to say, there are many spheres of social action which are not in the market. We are going to bring them into the market. Now, what a socialist strategy would be to take them out of the market. And if you ask people, would you rather live in a world which provides use values to people directly for housing, education, healthcare, and does it freely? Would you rather live in a society of that sort, or a society that rations the access to housing, healthcare, education via a market structure that kind of says the more money you have, the more you can get of these use values, and the inequality that results from that? So one of the major contradictions that Marx talks about in Capital on page 1 is between use value and exchange value. And effectively, the exchange value system destroyed the capacity of many people to get use values in housing, in which case you kind of say, let's get rid of the exchange value system and let's go find a way of providing a decent house and a decent living environment that is not mediated through the exchange value system, which allows some people to get incredibly rich at the expense of the rest of us, while not delivering decent house and a decent living environment to the mass of the population. So, in fact, we have many situations where use values are provided directly. Historically, there have been. Water and things like that always used to be a free good. And it used to be, I was educated in a situation where I got right the way through to my doctorate without paying anything. And I think that this is something which is perfectly feasible to construct in a society. So step by step, you take vital aspects of daily life and take them out of the market and put them into a different sphere of social action.
Isso sugere uma espécie de recuperação, vou falar assim, do estado do bem-estar social, dos direitos sociais, que eram valores de uso e que não eram adquiridos. É mais ou menos essa ideia.
Yes. You know, it's fascinating to me. We like to think that civilization advances, but actually, a lot of the time, civilization regresses. And we're in this regressive state right now, where the only answer, we're told, is to get even more regressive. That is, let the market do even more damage than it's already doing. And, you know, this is the crazy, almost insane situation in which we find ourselves, and we're becoming more and more barbaric. And I think these phrases which are emerging right now of, you know, vulture funds and, you know, and what they're trying to do to Argentina with the debt and so on. I mean, this is vulture capitalism. and why would we tolerate something of this sort?
Professor Harvey, numa de suas declarações anteriores, o senhor fez referência ao pós-neoliberalismo nas universidades. Como o senhor vê essa tendência do assalto do pós-neoliberalismo nas universidades? Isso é mais típico nos Estados Unidos, em alguns países na Europa, outros países? Isso envolve também a universidade pública, além da privada? Qual é a sua visão a respeito?
I think... You know, obviously, conditions differ from one country to another, so it's very dangerous to generalize. But, you know, when I first got into university, universities were viewed as public institutions, even when they were private, and that they had a public mission. Increasingly, they're seen as institutions that have a private mission. And essentially private interests regulate more and more what is done in the university and how it is done in the university. And this then actually enters into the psychology of many people teaching in the university. So you get the neoliberal academic who's an entrepreneur. So we have academics who are entrepreneurs and consider their lives as entrepreneurial practices in which they don't collaborate with each other very easily. They actually compete with each other, and this is supposed to be good. And I kind of think that this is one of the things that is rather sad about university life, because at its best, we helped each other understand, helped each other do things. And there is some of that still going on, and in fact it is re-emerging in the software development community and in some parts of the university.
Eu queria lamentar dizer que nosso tempo acabou. Nós estamos aqui numa conversa interessantíssima, mas eu queria agradecer o nosso convidado, o geógrafo David Harvey, que também é professor de antropologia na Universidade da cidade de Nova York, e aí um sábio que percorre o mundo dando aulas de lições que todos agradam, que interessam, que tem que discutir. Queria dizer que aqui ele está lançando esse livro, Para Entender o Capital, que é muito bom para entender esse outro livro do Karl Marx, que, olha, eu vou dizer para vocês, quem já tentou ler e acabou, suou, vai ajudar. Bem, queria agradecer também a professora Flávia Barros, que aqui está comparecendo aí com várias questões, a jornalista Helena Martins. Para saber mais sobre o nosso programa, entre no site da TV Brasil. Desde já, eu convido para um novo encontro aqui na próxima terça-feira.